Here's a strange beginning to a strange story. My dad was born in 1917. And his father left his wife and her 6 kids in the Great Depression. And by the time my dad was 12, he was working in factories to support the family. His dad had actually brought a mistress and her kids into the home and made them all live together. So it was the wife and the mistress, and then their kids, and then the 6 kids and my dad. And by the time he was 20, he was in all kinds of trouble and ended up in the state penitentiary for car theft for 2 years, and went on from there. But that's a little science fiction-y, because if you look at me, it doesn't seem like that guy would have a dad that would be born in 100 years ago. Now, my mom was schizophrenic and was institutionalized and in shock treatment. Jesus appeared to her in a vision while she was in shock treatment, and she became a Christian, and that defined the rest of her life. Even though she struggled with her schizophrenia, God actually used her weakness to turn him to herself. Turn her to himself. And she had quite a testimony. So these are my parents, who I've never met. And because my mom was schizophrenic and my dad was an alcoholic, and they met in a homeless institution, they were both in and out of institutions at different times, and had chronic issues with homelessness and stuff because of their problems. They had to give me up for adoption, and it wasn't because they didn't love me, it was because they couldn't take care of me. And I was taken from my mom immediately and put into foster care, and I was in foster care for 3 years, and I was adopted into a household that was pretty interesting. My dad worked in the juvenile court system and had access to information he probably shouldn't have. Anyway, he was able to actually pick me out because I looked like him, and he brought me home to save his marriage. He was having an affair, and there were some real difficulties with my mom, my adopted mom. Anyway, it didn't work out. So within a year of being adopted, they were divorced. And my dad sort of disappeared in my mind. He was the one who brought me home, and I didn't bond with the adoptive mother. And she tried. She was very young. She was on her own. She was really bitter. She was so mad at my dad that she kept custody of me, and things might have turned out differently if I'd gone with him. Now, I did not know until my dad died, when I was in my 30s, that he was fighting for custody for years. And when he died, I inherited a journal that documented his struggle as a lawyer to try to get his son from someone he viewed as abusive and neglectful. And he documents page after page after page after page of instances of abuse and neglect that I remember quite clearly. And my mom to this day apologizes. I mean, you know, when you grow older, when you're young, it's easy to look at someone and go, you should never. I was so mad and bitter growing up. But you know what? I mean, I don't know that I would have done any better if I was in my 20s and in the situation she was in. The other thing is, she worked down in the crime lab. She was in forensics, and she was over the crime lab, and in a city that is one of the most dangerous cities in the world, or I'm sorry, not in the world, in the country. And that made for a real crazy time, because she would testify against murderers and send them to jail, and when they would get out, she'd have death threats. So there were cops circling around the house and stuff. So there was a lot of fear and darkness in her life because of what she had to deal with on a daily basis, and I just can't even imagine. But anyway, the story gets weirder, but because we lived in the city, there were no good schools in the city in the public school system where you would not, get knifed or something. So she joined the Catholic Church across the street from us. Now, she's an atheist. Joined the Catholic Church across the street from us. And it was a strict Italian Catholic situation, because we lived in a little Italian neighborhood. And I went to strict Italian Catholic schools where I had teachers named Sister Felicetta and Sister Philomena. And this was like at a time when they made you write with your right hand, because Jesus is seated at the right hand of the Father. It was that kind of strict, and I was left-handed. Being in this situation was really tough, and we went to Mass almost every other day. And I would sit in the pew while every other kid in the school filed past me to go to communion, and with their hands folded in holy gesture, they would glare at me thinking, he's going to hell. It was written all over their face. And the teachers did not like me. I was always on the verge of getting kicked out, because I had such a traumatic start and a disorienting sense of myself and everything. I had a lot of behavior issues. Anyway, I wasn't liked. Parents did not want their kids playing with me. There would be invitations to everybody in the class but me to birthday parties and stuff like that, and the teachers supported that because they didn't like me either. Now, I thought I was rejected by God. Early on, that was my view of God, even in grade school. It wasn't that I didn't believe he was real. I believed that he rejected me and I was unclean, and that message just was reinforced from every direction. And I grew up hating myself and hating everybody else. I was full of hate. And full of hate. My goodness. When I was a teenager, I read a lot of science fiction and became what I thought of as an atheist, and I took great pleasure in arguing with Christians and debating them because I thought they were very dumb and bigoted and all the stereotypes. I believed all that stuff, And anyway, I went on. The only thing my mom, one good thing she did for me was bought me a piano early on. It's kind of a weird thing though, because she would have me practice. She was very, very literal, and the teacher told her if he doesn't practice a half-hour a day, he's not going to make any progress. So she was frugal and did not pay for babysitters, and we lived across the street from school, so I would go home from school and close the door, and this is as early as 1st and 2nd grade, and I was not to open the door if anybody knocked on it, and I was to wait for her to come home, which wouldn't be till 6, which is a long time to leave a kid alone at that age. And I know, because I've got a 5-year-old. I would never do that if he was 7 or 6. Anyway, she would have me practice into a tape recorder, and when she would come home, she'd listen to it, and for every 5 minutes under the half hour, I was penalized with owing her 15 minutes on the weekend. Well, for a first grader or a second grader, campdown races, I mean, there's only so many times you can play that. And a half hour was impossible. And it was a setup for failure. And that was the MO for her for a long time. And that is there's a whole reason for that kind of stuff. But by the time the weekend rolled around, I owed her hours of practice, and she'd make me do it. She was a stickler, and I remember being at that piano, just falling asleep at the piano and crying at the piano and just hating it. A few years later, she married a lovely man who was an alcoholic and had a history of suspicious deaths in his family. That his kids warned my mom might be related to his behavior. Now, we eventually fled that house after she suspected that he cut her brake lines. And also one time he left the gas on the pilot or something like that at the house. And there were a couple things that she was already geared to be suspicious because of her job. And based on what his kids said and based on his behavior, he was a piece of work. He was kind of a sadist. We fled one time when he was on a business trip. We moved out, but we were there for several years, and he did not like me at all. Another one. And he used to come and stare at me. I wasn't allowed to have my stuff in the house, so he had fixed up a utility room, carpeted it, and that was my bedroom, and it was a really small space. But anyway, I wasn't allowed to have my stuff in the house and everything. So in my bedroom, I had my piano and a desk and a dresser and an organ and no bed. I slept on the floor. And he was scary, and he would come and stare at me at night when he thought I was asleep. He'd stand and smoke cigarettes and stare at me. And, I mean, for like an hour. So you start to think, I wonder what's going on with that. So I started closing my door and locking it, and I would discover in the morning that it was opened. So he was using a screwdriver or something to open that door. So I used to then put my dresser, I'd push my dresser across the door to keep him from being able to open it. Well, my escape was music, and I would just I would get home. I practiced. This is in early high school, grade school, high school. I would practice for hours and hours and hours and hours, and that was my escape, my refuge. That and reading science fiction. So anyway, all my personality issues, and I had behavior issues and social issues, and on top of it, probably some mental issues, and I was a piece of work. And when I became a young adult, I pretty much just fled the scene, and I became a musician. When I was about 19, I learned to turn geeky and awkward into sensual and aloof. So I would go to gay bars and stuff and clubs, and I was straight, but I would use these situations to get in where I couldn't get in elsewhere. And because I had learned to carry myself in these places where I didn't have to talk, because I couldn't hold a conversation to save my life, became plunged into immorality, drugs, and just pretty much just living a very hedonistic lifestyle for several years. And then I joined a band, and that became really popular, really, really popular. And so my life consisted of playing in this band and doing my musician lifestyle, and pretty much just trying not to think about the fact that my life means nothing, and I hate myself. And my worldview was very negative because I grew up in a family of my mom's side. They were all geniuses, and they were able to articulate with utmost clarity the world situation. I remember Thanksgiving dinners. I mean, even my wife, she doesn't like going there for Thanksgiving because they're like atheist preppers and who believe that the shit's gonna hit the fan. So, and my grandpa would talk for hours about the Federal Reserve and the economy and the exports and the balance of trade and what's happening to the dollar and what's happening with diseases, and they would just sit around, and their entertainment was to pick apart the world system and show you that there's no hope. And you would leave these family functions feeling like, what is the point of even living, And anyway, that was my worldview. And so I looked to science fiction as sort of like secular prophecy, this notion that maybe we would make contact out among the stars, or some race of superior beings would introduce us to, new technologies or something. That was our hope. And humanity was ruined and needed to be transformed, but my view of transformation would be stamp out all the Christians and get rid of the overpopulation, weed the population down, have a litmus test based on intellect as to whether or not you could participate in the new order that would emerge as we, reformed ourselves so that we could join the galactic brotherhood that we were invited to. Of course, I would be one of the ones. In my imagination, I would be one of the heroes that helped bring about this, these significant changes, and I would have magical powers too, So this is the kind of stuff that was going on in my head. But then I started working at a studio, and I was in a popular band, and because of that, I had some semblance of respect as a musician, and that it opened a door for me, and I found myself in this studio with someone who would become my best friend for life, and he was the smartest person I've ever met in my life, and he is, or one of them, he was a really fantastic bass player and an engineer, and he was well respected, so I respected him because of that. And I knew he was smart. He built that studio. And I had a B room full of all my equipment. Now, the equipment I had was stolen, basically. I wouldn't say stolen. What I would do is I would manipulate myself into situations where I had all the talent and somebody else had all the gear. And they would fix their hope on me being able to make something out of all this gear that they had purchased and make them a famous band member of some kind. And eventually the gear would need to be at my house because, I'm the one making the music. And before he knew it, I had everybody's gear in my house, and I had this great big studio of stuff that wasn't mine. Oh my gosh, I was such a manipulator. I was Jacob, like Jacob in Laban's house. But anyway, I took advantage of people, and eventually their gear ended up with me, and I ended up in this place as a B room in this studio, and this guy was writing a book, and he had a whole library downstairs in his basement of conspiratorial histories. This was in the 90s, so this stuff was kind of rare. Metaphysics, UFOs, world religious scriptures, everything I was interested in, really. And I devoured his library. Now, I did not have conversations with him because I knew he was a fundamentalist Christian, and I had feelings about that. But I knew that he must be different than the ones I had met before. He was very gentle, very nice, very kind, and obviously smart. Anyway, as I'm going through his books, I started wanting to ask him some questions, because he had a lot of books on the UFO phenomena specifically, and whether or not our history had been littered with residue, culturally and archaeologically and everything, that indicated that we'd had contact with beings in our past that were from somewhere else, the stars, for the heavens, you know. And I wanted to ask him and have conversations about this stuff. And that was when I found out that I had met my match. And also I found out I knew nothing about the Bible. I'd never read it. I just had a whole library in my head, a little database of unfounded assertions I could quote at will to disarm most Christians. But boy, he was able to, he'd hear my half-baked argument, and he would help me refine the argument, like, and tell me how, no, what you're really trying to say is this, and here's where you got that idea, and that is from this school of thought, and that was originated by this guy, and he had this history and was involved in this group and that group, and go on and on and on to help me clarify my thought, to show that he was an expert in that thought process. And then he would refute it with the scriptures. He would take it apart, and he did it in such a way that it didn't make me feel like a loser. It made me feel like a winner for having been validated that I had questions, and like I had just gotten a treasure when I got the answer. That's how, I've never seen anything like it. He had a gift, and he didn't know he was operating a gift because he was backslidden at the time. I got saved. Long story short, his book was about world history and the ideologies that were behind the world empires and the priesthoods behind those ideologies, and the literal claims that they made about beings that they had contacted that gave them bodies of knowledge that they wielded over a superstitious populace to establish their selves as the ones with the right to rule. And eventually they would get behind a god king, or a king, a puppet, that they would demand that everybody worship. And this is the history of the major world empires, and these are all foreshadows of a last great world empire that's to come, which as Christians we know is the New World Order, or the beast system, out of which Antichrist will emerge, who will be the final god king that will demand that everybody worship him. And the groups that are in place that have these beliefs are openly satanic, and they are the founders of the major world religions and the world empires, and they've let us know who they are by leaving their symbols everywhere in architecture and in their poetry and in their schools and their education, and everything is littered with the symbolism that all points back to the serpent and the illuminating knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the worship of the sun as Lucifer, the light bearer, who they believe will eventually initiate us into a new age where mankind realizes that he's God. And well, that was my worldview that I'd inherited through science fiction and everything, and I saw it for what it was. So it was a shattering paradigm shift for me that completely undid me. And I was in college at the time, and all my papers that I was writing at the time were crazy about, my mom thought that I was having a schizophrenic episode, knowing my biological history and everything, but everything got crazy. Now, at the same time, though, we got all fired up, and when you've got iron sharpening iron, he got his spirit renewed, And we started telling everybody what we were seeing. And this was in the 90s when the internet wasn't even out yet. So this was all new information to people. And we saw tons of people get saved. And we had our apartment open, and musicians were coming, and they would come, and we would talk for 8 and 9 hours at a time. And Hunter was, my friend was really good at Bible study at the time, and could help people get into Daniel and Revelation and look at the Greek and see firsthand the power of the Word of God. And it was a time when the church was in revival anyway, and we got to taste that and lead people to the Lord in a season unlike anything I've ever seen again. And we always pined for those days, because it was so wonderful, and we saw miracles. And we didn't have a church at the time, and we hadn't been taught for or against anything really. And the Bible says and these signs will follow those who believe. They'll lay hands on the sick and they shall recover, and in my name they'll cast out demons. And we saw stuff like that. I remember one guy led to the Lord who was a good friend of mine. He stuttered his whole life and could barely get a conversation out. And one time I told him, your tongue was, I remember what God said to Moses, who stammered, and for some reason I found myself saying to him, your tongue was created to speak the word of God. Go home and read the book of John out loud tonight, and you'll never stutter again. And sure enough, he was cured. He did that, and he never stuttered again. A number of things like that. Now, that's not anything special about us. That's just the Lord in a time of revival, in a season where he was confirming his word. We were crazy zealots, and I had to drop out of college because I was preaching constantly, and even in all my papers I was preaching the gospel, and it was getting to be a bit much. And at the same time, we joined a church, and that's the next part of the story, which I'll do in the next video, where I want to start talking about the tour God led me through, the backside of Christianity and the different belief systems I encountered. It was quite a journey, but in this church, all my shame issues came back. I was boldly preaching the gospel, and then I got confronted with some legalism that shut me down and made me focused on myself. And as I focused on myself, I realized I was being completely out of control, and I dropped out of college and everything in embarrassment. I'll leave it there. I'm at my destination, but that is the first part of this story, and I'm just gonna kind of put these up. I do feel like I want to share my testimony, because I do believe that now, as I get into the different belief systems I weeded through in apostate Christianity, and where I found solutions to comfort me, I believe that my experiences and the word of truth that comforted me will comfort others who've been through ridiculous journeys. And I shared the first part of my story just because it's pretty silly, and it's kind of crazy, and it's unique. There's a full circle where at the end I got to find out who my biological parents are, and I'm actually going to the church that took care of my mother for the last 10 years of her life, and that is a beautiful story. And that discovery led to a revival in my Christian life too, and I'm very thankful. All right, I will talk to you soon. This is part 1.